Land and sea, the relationship between land management and flood control. As environmental hazards are being increasingly compounded by global climate change, it is imperative that we reevaluate our risk management strategies. In light of recent events such as Hurricane Sandy and Harvey, this study aims to focus on the risks related to pluvial or rain-related flooding in urban areas, particularly as it relates to urban planning as well as land use. Unfortunately, when considering risk management, scientific evidence alone is not enough to convince policymakers and voters of an issue's importance. This often leads to communities ignoring regulations geared towards preventing disaster in favor of seemingly more important issues, such as development. Thus, communities and urban centers will likely ignore the potential threats and be ill-equipped to handle natural disaster. In order to change public policy and the way the American people see risk management, climatologists and urban planners must appeal to political and social contexts as well. An example of focusing on development without environmental hazards in mind is a city's ground cover composition. While areas with green ground cover, such as parks and gardens, will absorb incoming floodwaters similarly to a sponge, surface areas that are impermeable, such as concrete, asphalt, and shingled roofs, simply compound the amount of water that must run off and overflow in the event of a flood. This phenomenon of short-sighted development is often termed paving the sponge. In this study, I focus on the city of Houston. Due to an economic boom spearheaded by the fossil fuel industry, Houston began to experience rapid growth and expansion in the recent decades. This resulted in a focus on development with less emphasis on flood preparedness in mind, which is a critical risk for a coastal city such as Houston to take. In this study, our research question is as follows. Using ArcGIS software, how can we identify problem areas that will be prone to flooding, as well as areas that we can conserve and restore to promote flood mitigation? My first model is a flooding vulnerability calculator. After converting the FEMA 100-year floodplain into raster data, I was able to use a raster calculator and cross-analyze it with imperviousness data, which refers to how impervious the ground is. For this calculator, I decided that any areas with imperviousness greater than 50% while residing in the 100-year floodplain would be areas that are highly vulnerable to flooding and thus should seek change. The resulting map shows the Houston metropolitan area with the high flood vulnerable areas marked in red. These areas meet the criteria of lying within the FEMA 100-year floodplain as well as having greater than 50% impermeable surface. Thus, there will be a high amount of runoff during the event of a flood or a rainstorm. If we zoom into the Houston metropolitan area, we can see that much of the surface area meets this criteria and thus would be highly vulnerable in the event of a flood, such as Hurricane Harvey. After making a model highlighting the vulnerable areas, I made a model highlighting the areas that should be conserved, or the areas that were developed in a smart way. These areas, which I termed green space conservation priorities, meet the criteria that they are within the FEMA floodplain and they've got a percent impervious below 20%. Thus, in the event of a flood or a rainstorm, they will absorb much more water and have much less urban runoff than the red areas that I previously marked. You can see here that these areas tend to be more on the outskirts and periphery of Houston and become more sparse as you go deeper into the metropolitan area. These areas, in and of themselves, provide valuable flood control, and thus we should prioritize conserving their green space. Creating stricter development regulations in areas such as these could help us achieve that goal. The Harris County Flood Control District, which oversees flooding regulations in the city of Houston and its surrounding areas, pointed to the effectiveness of prairie grass as well to absorb floodwater. While it may be difficult to conserve green space within the city, it could be significantly easier to conserve and restore prairie outside of the city. In 2015, a report by the Flood Control District maintained that the restoration of 1 acre of prairie would offset an extra volume of runoff created by 2 acres of single-family homes or a 1-acre commercial property. Furthermore, the flood control district maintains that developers should have to follow regulations that reverse the effects of paving over wetlands and prairies. This can be done in a simple way by building what is called a detention pond, which is simply a depression in the ground that temporarily stores rainwater when it falls on the pavement and isn't absorbed into the ground. Existing prairies outside of Houston, such as the Katy Prairie Conservancy, provided huge measures of flood control in the event of floods such as Hurricane Harvey. While these systems absorb much of the rainwater, they also make positive contributions to water quality as well as natural habitat in the entire county. Thus, there is high flood control interest in preserving this land. Unfortunately, Harris County Flood Control District does not have reasonable financial resources to secure vast amounts of land in the Katy Prairie, nor does it have the authority to prohibit development activity that conforms to established policy. However, the Katy Prairie Conservancy has stated a goal to secure 50,000 acres of contiguous land within the prairie, and there's a flood control interest in supporting this goal. Efforts should be made to conserve and buy up this prairie and have strict regulations to prevent it from becoming developed. In addition to being rich in prairie resources, Houston is also host to many wetland areas. These areas act like a natural drain in the event of a flood, as well as providing storm protection. In a recent study conducted by the University of California, Santa Cruz, the wetlands areas around New York City prevented an estimated $625 million in damage during the recent Hurricane Sandy. In fact, areas that were closer to wetlands had damages that were consistently lower than areas without. I created this model with the conservation of prairie and wetlands in mind. Using data from the FEMA 100-year floodplain, as well as land cover data from Harris County, I was able to calculate areas within the floodplain that would provide valuable flood control as well as drainage. While keeping in mind that this area would not be easy to conserve and would be highly expensive, I decided to add the data of park areas and use Euclidean distance to find areas that were valuable in flood protection as well as near parks. Thus, these parks could consider expanding or buying up land near them to prevent it from being developed. This would create a greater infrastructure that would help resist flooding as well as storm protection. The Euclidean distance I used for this model was 5,000 meters. Thus, all the areas that are valuable for flood protection and highlighted in the following map are also within 5,000 meters of public or park land. Upon taking a closer look at coastal parks and public lands, we can see that there's actually much useful, undeveloped, flood-resistant land next to or near these parks. We could consider prioritizing conserving these lands, such as buying them up, increasing developing regulations, or expanding the parks into those lands. Regardless, conservation of these lands should be prioritized because they provide valuable natural infrastructure that can mitigate flood disasters such as Hurricane Harvey. Upon taking a closer look at parks such as this, we can see that it's surrounded by much developed land, marked in red. However, there is also highly valuable land that is undeveloped, consisting of prairies, wetlands, and agricultural land. If the parks were to consider expanding into these areas, or at least passing stricter regulations for development here, we could also have a valuable infrastructure for preventing flooding against rainstorms and other natural hazards. Conserving land such as this would be a very simple way in the steps to lowering the risks and making it easier to manage against natural disasters in the city of Houston. This study concludes that efforts in urban planning should be increasing green space as well as reducing the amount of impermeable surface throughout Houston's metropolitan area. Furthermore, Harris County is rich in prairie grasslands and wetlands, and public funds should be diverted to conserving and reestablishing these areas. These would provide valuable natural infrastructure, flood control, and storm resistance. As you can see, there is still much undeveloped land within Houston, and with the proper insight, we can develop in a smart, sustainable way and have a lower risk and better risk management system for the future.